Good to see all of you, by the way.
Great. I see. Thank you all for being patient. I see that a number of you are now joining us, I believe. Ellen, can you just confirm that we are live?
Yes, we are live. Yes, we are
okay,
live.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're having a few technical difficulties here, so thank you very much for your patience. I think we're all good to go. So welcome everyone. My name is Ben Jani. I'm an associate professor at the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism, and I lead up the urbanism program there, which is relevant only to the extent that this particular lecture is really dealing with things urban. So I'm extremely pleased to be able to welcome you all here tonight. Joining us for this evening's lecture are Alex Josephson of Partisans, and Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. We are going to begin tonight's lecture with a presentation by Mary Rowe, who will discuss some of the demographic shifts underway in Canada and their impact on smaller towns, including towns around larger cities. And following Mary, Alex Josephson will share the work of Partisans, taking us through some of the firm's projects relative to the overall themes that we're discussing tonight. And then we'll end the evening with a Q&A on some of the themes that I've just mentioned, finishing up no later than 7:30 p.m. So tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Urban Land Institute, the Ottawa chapter of the Urban Land Institute. And we're very fortunate to be joined tonight by Jameson Young, who is a partner at BLG and the chair of the Ottawa chapter of ULI. So I'd like to invite Jameson just to introduce us to a little bit about ULI.
Thanks very much, Ben, and good evening, everyone. So I'm Jameson Young, and I'm the chair of the Ottawa chapter of ULI. And I'd like to begin by saying big thanks to the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism for its partnership with ULI in this lecture. We at ULI are very proud to continue our collaboration with the school, which has seen the origination and growth of, amongst other things, the Carleton Certificate in Real Estate and Development, which I'll just take this opportunity, and Ben will commend me, I'm sure, for plugging it. The CRED course is in its fourth offering this fall. So, we've had 4 iterations of this and it's gone exceptionally well. From my own experience as an instructor and vicariously through participants, I can say it's a very valuable opportunity for those interested in broadening and deepening their understanding of the very multidimensional world of real estate and development. And so you can inquire with Ben or myself if you're interested in learning more about this. I also want to tell you a little bit about ULI. So the Urban Land Institute is the largest and oldest organization of real estate and land use experts in the world. It's dedicated to research and education and not advocacy, which makes it unique in some ways in the development of our urban spaces. Membership gives you access to studies, reports, programs, resources like this one, and of course, a remarkable local and global network. There are special rates for government, not-for-profit, academia, and students as well. And very importantly, if you're interested in personally dedicating yourself to a cause like this, we in Ottawa have a terrific network of locally engaged professionals of every discipline, and we'd be happy if you'd be interested to roll up your sleeves and join us. Please look me up if you'd be interested. I'm really looking forward to hearing this lecture, whose objects align very closely with those of ULI, namely promoting quality urban environments. So in advance, I want to thank Mary Rowe and Alex Josephson for what will no doubt be a compelling exchange. And thanks again to the Israeli School for their partnership in this event. So please enjoy the lecture.
Thanks so much, Jameson. So great. With that in mind, let's move to this evening talk. Before we do, a few brief logistical notes for those of you less familiar with Zoom, the particular webinar format of Zoom that we're using tonight. We'd like to call your attention to the different features. There's no need to mute yourself. This is done automatically. And there's a Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom window, which can be used to ask the panel questions. In line with this, the chat function has been disabled, or at least we think it has. So it's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Suzanne Harris-Brantz, my colleague here at Carleton, who will introduce Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thanks, Ben. It's a great pleasure to introduce the first of our evening speaker, Mary Rowe, as Ben said, from the Canadian Urban Institute. Mary is a leading urban advocate and civil society trailblazer who has worked in cities and with communities across Canada and the United States. She is president and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute and former president of the Canadian platform Ideas That Matter. During a mid-career fellowship with the US-based Blue Moon Fund, she worked in New Orleans to support neighborhood rebuilding projects in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Prior to joining CUI, Mary lived in New York and served as executive vice president of the Municipal Art Society, which is one of America's oldest civil advocacy organizations focused on the built environment. Mary is a frequent contributor to national and international city building programs, including UN Habitat, the Massey City Summit, the Art of City Building, and the World Urban Forum. She is also a frequent media commentator and writer. Under Mary's leadership, CUI has expanded its work to include an international network from government, industry, community, and city building professions to advance research and collaborate on solutions to some of our greatest urban challenges. Mary is the facilitator of BICEP, an alliance of senior executives leading some of Canada's most significant urban regions, for which CUI is the secretariat. Lastly, Mary is a senior fellow with SureFast, a national charity focused on building community economies, and she is the creator, executive producer, and host of City Talk, a regular virtual discussion featuring a diverse lineup of leading and emerging voices on the most pressing issues of the day. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Mary. It's really wonderful to have you. Feel free to share your screen and begin whenever you feel ready.
Thanks, gang. We've been technologically challenged today for some reason, and I'm on this platform all the time. So I don't know what's actually contributing to it, but Susie, will you just wave at me if because we're now using two devices. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well, thanks.
And you can see me, so on some screen. So
that's great.
I'm going to breeze through these and just talk a bit generally about how we at CUI can come to terms with this. And I'm very appreciative that Alex is on because he's going to provide you with some kind of visionary leadership about what's possible. But I love the title, Reassembly, that you're choosing. I interestingly spoke to the Ontario Library Association on Saturday. Their theme was Se rassembler, which is actually to gather. So I just ripped it off and used the same phrase from there to this because I think it's a fabulous conception of what this moment is giving us. A moment to really put back together the elements of urbanism in a way that makes sense. And some of what we are struggling with, I would say, I'm not a prognosticator. I'm a person who feels that we should be dealing with things as they come up. The world is full of people that predict cities are dead or cities are changing. I think that they're obviously going to change, but we don't actually know how they're going to change. So I'm reserving any kind of speculation, only to say that what we want to do is start to pay attention to what we see happening and what the opportunity might be. And that's why it's great that you have a designer like Alex, and it's great that ULI and the School of Architecture and all the different partners in Ottawa are converging on this, because it's going to take all of that to kind of imagine and conceive what the future of our cities needs to look like. And it's at a particularly poignant moment in terms of what you're observing in your city right now, and how vulnerable actually the urban form is, and also watching over the last few days, as I'm sure Alex did as well, how the urban form in other cities actually enabled a certain kind of precaution to be taken that, for whatever set of interesting reasons, didn't occur in Ottawa. So we don't need to speculate on that, but I'm just saying it really talks to us about why the spatial city matters. So in terms of the actual focus of this talk about what is the impact that we're going to see in other communities, smaller communities, CUI's focuses on all cities, but primarily on the larger ones, and then looking at what that means in terms of what happens around the regions that support them. So obviously, since the pandemic, as you know, we've seen all sorts of changes. Lots of it is anecdotal. We don't actually know what will stick. For instance, if you look at some of the large American cities, there was a certain flood where people went to second residences, but that's different than actually moving. And so it's going to be hard for us to actually see how much of this actually sticks. But those early statistics that we saw in that first year, July to July of last year, 65,000 people moving out of Toronto, 40,000 getting out of Montreal, and then about 12,000 leaving Vancouver. But again, whether or not this population actually sticks is going to be a really interesting thing to observe. And I think a lot of it will have to do with choice, and it will have to do with quality of life, obviously. So at the same time as you had these kinds of bifurcations where people were moving into the region, into the smaller communities, the other issue is that immigration dropped considerably, even though not as much as you might have thought it would have. So again, we need the real numbers, folks, to be able to see truly what the situation is. Even in, this is the London, UK, what they saw is a population boost by 62%. But again, will that stick? How much of that is people going to second homes versus actually relocating? So I know, for instance, in Halifax, they're in a double digit last year, and suddenly they have an acute housing crisis because they've never actually taken in more than 10,000 people in a single year, and they did. Where did they all come from? Not quite sure. But again, these things are going to evolve over time. And I don't know if we're going to see, like we see the pandemic puppy, where you get a dog during the pandemic, but then after the pandemic, do you actually keep the dog? I don't know the extent to which people who have relocated and are in Collingwood or in the Gatineau or wherever they've gone, whether they'll stay. This is all kind of for us to pay attention to. But CUI is in this business of the relationship between people, place, and then what that means in terms of potential. And we really have focused on how do we build better connective tissue? Again, Alex will reflect this in his work because architects think about a connective tissue all the time, and we're just manifesting this in the policy field. We're saying we need better horizontal connections in Canada. We do vertical, municipal to provincial to federal. Now we need to connect city to city, and we need to connect practitioner to practitioner, and then see how that should inform provincial and federal policy and local policy. So just in terms of the general impact, I think you all have a visceral sense of this, and it's a specific situation in Ottawa because of the complexion of the downtown. But the economic impact over this last 2 years is extraordinary. And even as things reopen, we actually don't know. We won't be able to visibly see what the recovery looks like. It's going to take some time. We also don't know what the choices will be in terms of working from home and what those hybrid relationships will look like. We at CUI started to focus on main streets early. Main streets were in trouble pre-COVID because of people's choices around where they were purchasing, but also just generally, I would say there was a kind of disinterest that had sort of been fostered over a couple of decades where people got into their cars, went to the smart center rather than walking 2 or 3 blocks. And I think those sort of pre-existing conditions have been exacerbated. But the great thing about the Main Street concept is it works at every scale. Every community understands even a large city understands when you say main streets. They may have several, but they know what you're talking about. Similarly, a small community may have a 4 corners or intersection, but they have a sense that there is a place. There is a center, there is something that actually draws people in for commercial activity, for a sense of attachment and belonging and conviviality. And also at the same time, a lot of small businesses are actually in those kinds of conurbations. They're in those forums, in those smaller communities and in those main streets. So as we look at the impact on Main Street, and if you remind yourself just what actually happens, who actually works for these small businesses in main streets, it's most of the working Canadian population. So here we are with this staggering statistic since the beginning of the pandemic. And even as we emerge, what's that going to look like? So we've been working with all sorts of people and engaging folks on what do the design implications mean? What's the investment implication? How can we actually engage a cross-section of folks to start thinking about this and imagining what the future of main streets would be? So we've done a ton of research on this. We've got designers thinking about it, and we sort of came up with these organizing principles. And I think as we imagine smaller communities, I don't think we can just assume that the population is going to come and stay. I think it may catalyze for us prioritizing the kinds of investments in these other regional communities that are maybe adjacent to a large metropolitan center, maybe not, but I think generally the sort of commuter shed may mean that more people can stay there put and not have to come into downtown as often. But if you look at these components, it's a similar structure to the main street in a spine. People, places, anchor institutions, the business composition, and then leadership in terms of how do these things get led. And part of, we think, the kind of reanimation of these communities has to be everyone engaging. And sometimes it's not clear where the leadership would come from. So Canadians, we tend to default. You look at what's going on in Ottawa now, I see it anyway. People say, no, that'll be so-and-so, or that'll be the chief of police will act, or no, that'll actually be the RCMP, or, we tend to do this. We tend to sort of think someone else will do it. But in fact, it's probably going to be all of us that are going to have to do these things. So we've been administering the Healthy Communities Initiative, which are these fabulous examples of placemaking. And the reason I wanted to show some of these is because it speaks to the initiative that communities and people in communities have, but it also speaks to people investing in their place. And I think that's the important takeaway here, is that all these communities that are on a precipice of some kind of adjustment or change have some choices to make. And they have some measure of agency in terms of how they want to invest. I had these slides out for the library, so I kept them in because they're just so much fun, really. I don't know if anybody remembers that when Doug Ford was the city councillor, he tried to defund libraries. And he used the statistic that there were more Tim Hortons in Etobicoke than there were libraries. So I always just want to remind ourselves that these kinds of third places that communities create are really essential to the quality of life that a person experiences in their local community. It's just a proxy, though. There are many, many other kinds of institutions, but a library is a particular one you can kind of wrap your arms around, and it has all sorts of funding challenges that need to be addressed. So to me, that it's sort of emblematic of all the things that can reside in an urban environment actually can manifest in a library or a civic space. So if we look at the implications of what's really going on around us, what we're starting to recognize is that communities need to invest in their own assets to be able to keep their populations intact and to continue to attract newcomers of all kinds, newcomers that are coming out of urban environments and newcomers that are coming from somewhere else. And if you look at the reality of our fiscal picture for larger cities, they're going to get more expensive because they took a huge financial hit. The provincial and federal governments have only so much money. And so we're starting to model what that may look like. Just a second. And how that may affect people's quality of life if municipalities can't provide the services. So this is the reality of the technology now that we live with. These are four-score check-ins in Moscow, but we see that now drawn out across communities of all sizes in Canada. This is the kind of the kind of happenstance that we got along with COVID. We had heightened technology capacity, and so suddenly we're in a situation now where you can actually act on Jane Jacobs' principle that you have that cities only work when everyone is involved in engaging them. So if we can fix the access issue to make sure that we have digital access across the spectrum, all of a sudden you can work in a small community and you can continue to have your professional life or your working life, presumably some aspects of it, you can do it from somewhere else. So if we just remind ourselves that this is the fundamental piece that we have to, wherever we are, whether we're at a downtown intersection or whether we're in a more rural environment, that these kinds of connections that exist in nature obviously are part of what we have to emphasize. This is an interesting study that came out 3 days ago from Brookings. It's about the Midwest. I just saw it this morning, so I slapped it in here. It's basically saying to those Midwestern cities that are also observing what we're talking about, suddenly their populations are growing and their marketing is changing in those cities where they used to say they would try to get a factory or some kind of a high-tech company to relocate there. Now they're in a situation where actually what they can do is make investments in the quality of life and the quality of place to actually attract populations and keep them. So this, for me, is really where I'm going to pass to Alex to say that I think the challenge for us is going to be using existing assets, finding new ways of investing in them, creating that kind of connective tissue within the community, and also to allow me to have a connection with outside of my community, wherever I used to be or where my clients and customers are, and recognize that this is actually going to happen from the ground up. This is a great quote from Gilchin Lin. I don't know if anybody recognized this, that really what we're talking about, a humanistic globalization, would be a global network of intensely local places. This is a famous shot of Fogo Island, which is an extreme, but it's making that point that if we invest in local places and then have the connectivity to be able to connect with one another, we can do it. I throw this slide in because it's this time of year. This is my childhood, as you can see. This is the backyard 2 doors over from me, where there was a community rink. And this, as much as anything, informed my understanding of how cities and communities work. Because a neighbor flooded the backyard, and then all of us congregated to play Canada's game pretty much every day. And it was a seminal experience for me. And it was because we all lived on the same street. And that's where it all starts. And this is my last slide, this is Broadway, the night of Hurricane Sandy, 2 nights after Hurricane. When the lights went out south of 34th Street, I was living in New York, and this is looking north, and the whole lower Manhattan was in darkness. But what's fascinating about this is that what in fact ended up happening, as we know, is there was a reshuffling and there was a reinvigoration of the assets in New York City that contributed to create the dynamic city it is. So that's the set of choices before us. I really hope the technology did okay there and that you could hear me. And I'm gonna stop sharing and pass to Alex.
That's great. Thanks a lot for your insightful presentation, Mary. It's really wonderful to hear your thoughts on the kind of current shifts of community resiliency and some of the things that are related to small town urbanism. I'll now pass over to Ben to introduce Partisans and Alex Josephson.
Great. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Alex. I think we'll come back to a bunch of the issues that Mary raised in the Q&A. But in the meantime, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Partisans, and in particular, a partner of Partisans, Alex Josephson. Alex co-founded Partisans in 2012 with Puya Baktash, bringing strong creative vision to the rapidly growing architectural studio. Partisans is well recognized for its work on a diverse range of projects, including Fold House, Gusto 501, the Orbit, Innisfil, and Glitch Tower, some of which we'll be hearing about this evening. Personally, Alex is known for his rigorous commitment to the design vision for Partisans and his integrity for finding high impact creative solutions to complex design challenges. In addition to his work with Partisans, Alex is a lecturer and a core faculty member at the University of Toronto's Daniels School of Architecture, and he frequently writes and speaks on the future of architecture, design, and cities internationally, and is a guest contributor to Azure magazine. As a registered architect, he has received numerous accolades, including being named 2015's Best Emerging Designer by Canada's Design Exchange and being awarded the Globe and Mail's Catalyst Award for Design. He has the distinction of being the only Canadian to have ever received a New York Prize Fellowship of the Van Allen Institute. As a resident of Toronto, Alex earned his Master of Architecture from the University of Waterloo, and prior to starting Partisans, he worked in the studio of Doriana and Maximiliano Fuxas in Rome, Italy. So Alex, we're really thrilled to have you here. It's great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate that introduction. Susie and Mary, thank you so much as well. Mary, you are always so amazing to listen to, and you're always so generous. So I really appreciate your words and also your support over the years. And you've been a great inspiration to me as well. Thank you to Carleton and the Israeli School of Architecture. Thrilled to be here, and for all the guests, welcome. Yes, we're going to get back to in person, but thrilled to be here regardless, Zooming to you live. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Hold on one second. Sorry, excuse me. 1 second. All right, there we go. Am I coming in live, Ben?
All good, Alex.
Okay, great, awesome. Hopefully I can answer some of the or at least show some responses to the questions versus answers. I do believe that we live in a very unique context, being in Canada, and the circumstances in the housing market and how we're building cities is a kind of unique phenomena, I think, globally right now, especially because we're Canadian. We have a different take on humanism than a lot of other places in the world. But brief introduction to Partisans. we called ourselves partisans because we believe in fighting for a cause. We also tend to work on speculative works and projects that don't have clients. We also believe that it takes a village to undertake visionary projects rather than necessarily heroic figures. It takes heroic groups of people who have courage. This is our office. We're about 18 people, give or take, given how many people are part-time or full-time. People working from Colombia to Canada and also other places. So shout out to all the partisans out there. Really appreciate you all. Love you all. We started off, with a sauna, a lowly little sauna, a bar. Now working on towers, 55 Young, and others. Speculative towers like this in Shanghai. We call this the WTF. And of course, what I'm going to talk about more today is the orbit. But I also want to talk about the context in which we're designing and thinking. We are inspired by precedent. We're inspired by the past and other geniuses and pieces of history, such as the Tower of Babel. It's kind of idea of a vertical city, and depictions of it in classical art, but also Mesa Verde. These are sort of gorgeous moments in art, but also real history of city building that inspire us. Machu Picchu, Rome, depictions of the city are especially important because sometimes, as Robert Jan van Pelt from Waterloo always used to say, it's the depiction of the city and the propaganda around the depiction of the city that really also is part of the success of that city. And I've always found that was a kind of resonant lecture from Waterloo. Piranesi's depictions of Rome, theoretically, Paris, and obviously Le Corbusier's provocative ideas of tearing parts of it down to build these kinds of contexts. And thank God that this didn't happen, but nonetheless, a provocation about how cities could or should evolve and the issue of population densities and income inequality. But my favorite of all time is Super Studio, and I just love the irreverence and grandiosity of these ideas, but also the humor of these architectural theories and ideas of the city inspires us. Our first look at architecture was really Suburbalonia, and this was an investigation of Toronto as a series of socioeconomic driven neighborhoods we called ghettos, but really they're bubbles. And so Toronto as a kind of bubble city, a theoretical bubble city. And I think that this being 8 years old now or 7 years old in the context of where our real estate market is now is kind of prescient. This idea of Toronto as a bubble city. I think Bloomberg talks about Toronto's real estate market being a bubble weekly. So we called it Suburbalonia, this idea of, taking suburban sprawl, which we weren't allowed to build anymore because we'd extended the city as far as it was allowed to go, and took that vertical into the condominiumization of the city. We'd had this idea that maybe you could even reorganize it in bands so that people at the lakeshore had something in common with representation of the people up at the highways. People thought we were crazy. And then we wrote Rise and Sprawl. And this was an investigation as to how condominiumization was affecting urban form and fabric, especially through the lens of potentially becoming a licensed architect at the time, what it means to be an architect in that context. I'm just going to quickly show you the Amazon HQ2 bit. I think that part of the discussion about cities in Canada is as well as about a lack of understanding of the opportunities and realities through a narrative, something that's like a physical object. In this case, it was a book, but it told the economic and social and cultural stories of our greater Toronto and Hamilton community and why it's attractive. We tend to not build these narratives and documents. And part of my thesis is that cities need to tell stories, and they also need to articulate them in either digital or physical format. You need to build your brochure. I know it's sort of superficial, but having these things as assets is important. And this leads me to Innisfil. So Innisfil is an extraordinary opportunity. To give you context, Innisfil is run by a very different kind of group of people. It's a young staff, very adventurous, intrepid group of citizens. But this city, this town really is located north of Toronto in Canada, which we all know very well, and it is white right now because it's covered in snow. Toronto is about 60 kilometers south, and Innisfil borders Lake Simcoe's southwest corner. And the staff in Innisfil created an RFP 2 years ago to envision a new community around a transit hub that Metrolinx would be constructing. And really, the question was, for an agrarian culture, for a place that is some of the richest farmland in the province, close to Holland Marsh, what were we doing building a transit hub in the middle of a field there? Were we going to just build endless unsustainable sprawl, or were we going to do something different? And so there was a public RFP, and Partisans won that, and subsequently was hired on to extend our mandate into a developer-driven vision. So Innisfil, in a nutshell, is 260 square kilometers. Barrie is about 900 square kilometers. Toronto is 630, and you can see the different populations associated with those. Mississauga, fascinatingly, is a very close example area-wise. It's about 1 million people now, with a very low population density comparatively to other major metropolises, but it's almost all sprawl. And it's something we asked Innisfil, how do you want to build yourself out? And they said they wanted to protect their countryside and the agriculture, and try to do something that sparked a new way of allowing for development, but containing it and building up around infrastructure, instead of infrastructure being a kind of blight that no one really enjoys. And if you go back to some of the great infrastructure projects in Europe, and also Union Station in Toronto, which is now becoming the center of a neighborhood, infrastructure can be much more than just the infrastructure itself. It can be a platform for culture. It can be a platform for civic pride. It can be more than that. Innisfil was the first Uber public transit pilot project in Canada, one of the few in the world. That's another wonderful, interesting point about Innisfil. They also were one of the first, I think, cities in the world to accept Bitcoin and cryptocurrency as a tax payment. And so really what you see at the site is a GO station planned at the center of an area that isn't developed. There's a would-be development to the northeast, several spaghetti sprawl neighborhoods to the north, and then other hamlets that are growing up around it. And Innisfil itself is really like a series of hamlets that need connectivity. And it's interesting that Mary talked about connectivity, because we in Canada, because of just this sheer volume of area we don't think about the importance of just closeness, and we tend to be spread apart because we like space. The only problem with that is it's the very least efficient way to run a country, and a very expensive, unsustainable way to build out a future. So why an orbit? Well, these communities orbit each other, and we're hoping that the construction of the transit hub will really, be a kind of gravitational center of activity, culture, economics, an opportunity for a series of beautiful towns, hamlets, and preserve the agricultural potential of it as well. We looked at many different precedents that are radiant cities like Moshav in Israel, the Garden City by Ebenezer Howard, radial city, concentric cities like Burning Man. Paris grew out of a circle really in its own kind of organic, weird way too. But really it's a response to this idea of the urban plan to the left, the spaghetti plan as a kind of post-World War II invention for the production of homes, and the financialization of the home. So you go from like the Roman ancient Cardo Decumanus grid to this utopic concentric radial plan. And really the idea for those originally was that there would be industry in the middle. In this case, it's connectivity. Our innovation in this sense is, we live in a place that has a square parameter. So all the concession roads in Ontario are a rectilinear format. And so to build a circle inside of a square, you need to mediate those somehow. And so we have the Squircle plan, and that's how the fabric and the connective tissue of Innisfil orbit was really contemplated and invented. And it's about bridging a future and this optimistic vision for a 15-minute pedestrian, denser, I would say, sort of a denser accumulator of people versus like a metropolis. And if you look at the existing fabric, it's related to it directly. We studied different cities from New York, Barcelona, Chicago, places that were warm, places that were cold, to sort of see how we could be inspired from a scale perspective for these streets. Certain kinds of prototypes don't work. Like a Mashab city is far too sparse. Barcelona far too dense. Interestingly enough, Masdar is a really cool example of a 21st century smart city, but it's very rectilinear, and I worry about the socioeconomic underpinnings of Masdar, but that's another question altogether. And we get to this very green, carved, but contained idea of finding space for 100,000 people or more over the next 20 to 30 years without having to chew up and eat up all of the agricultural land in the process. And so if you look at this rendered plan, you've got a beautiful linear park along the rail corridor and a wetlands, a series of trails, radial streets that have main street qualities and side street qualities that get you to, as a pedestrian from your home to the transit center and economic center really easily, quickly, and in an environmentally friendly way. So that was how this rendered out. And this was our first stab at taking some of the ambitious ideas that we were inspired by and bringing them to a Canadian context. And we really saw it as a prototype for how new technologies such as rapid build, interesting technologies like rapid build timber and mass timber construction could be applied in a Canadian context, but also could you apply this idea across Canada to solve the incredible pressure to grow. And the one thing we haven't been great at in Canada is building transit around habitation. We've been terrible at planning for development along subway and transit lines. Unfortunately, recently some information came out that we're very slow and very expensive at building our infrastructure. And so this idea of the orbit is a way to take the cost of infrastructure and share it in terms of responsibility with the private sector, fund it through the private sector, and build it faster and more efficiently. That's the thesis and that's the proposal. Whether Canada can actually deliver on that promise is really going to be up to the municipality, the developers who own the land, and the transit agency to get together and really push that possibility. And in closing, I'm an optimistic Canadian. I think that this country has so much that the rest of the world needs. We're humanist. We really care about each other's rights, each other's dignity. We care about our environment. but I think we also have a very practical way of looking at things. And so I'm very interested to see how this project evolves, because in Canada, everything is a dialogue, and dialogue tends to change things as things go forward. So that's my take on the future of cities in Canada and what we can contribute. And again, I just thank everybody for their attention, and Mary, love Mary, she's great, and everybody at the Israeli School of Architecture. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Alex. It's really lovely to hear kind of what's underway in the design process at Partisans, and to hear some of your specific strategies for new approaches to development in Innisfil. You raised some really important topics and highlight some of the great areas for opportunity. We now have about 20 minutes for a more open discussion and Q&A. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, of course, so please feel free to write them in the Zoom Q&A, which is located on the bottom of your screen. There's an option there. As those start to come in, perhaps we can start with some questions from our own end. I can pass to Ben to ask the first question.
Thanks. I just wanted to mention to Ksenia that we will get to your question. I see Mary's keen to answer that, so we'll come to that in a second. Alex, teaching urbanism, teaching the history of cities, we recognize all kinds of things. Some of those you mentioned, the ideal cities, the Broke cities, as well as Ebenezer Howard one. The notion of the green belt. I mean, there is a whole tradition of visionary views for how cities should be done if they were planned from scratch, and this is amazing. I guess 2 points of clarification. Innisfil doesn't have a center now. The idea is that the center, the primary center, will develop around the transit stop. Was that it?
There is a sort of notional center right now. It's called Alcona, and it's like a very pleasant stretch of road that leads to a beach. But from a kind of like larger picture center, this is going to be the only transit hub in the vicinity. So it's going to be a game changer for that community. So it's interesting, sort of a small, a rural version of a kind of multinodal city, and that the transit hub will develop a new node, which presumably will become increasingly important over time. I guess the other question is, thinking about Ebenezer Howard and some of the others, and even comparing what you're doing to the sort of the transect vision, as we move out from the center, is there a change of use or simply just a change of density? Yeah, it's a good question. I imagine that there will be multifaceted organic changes to the use as it develops from the center out. I think that it does change in density for sure, but the project itself is also meant as a catalyst to bring uses in, and I think that that's the part that's missing in Canadian development. We tend to look at things site by site and project by project versus like, what if I did this? What is going to happen in 5 moves? And I feel like we need to start playing more of a long game, like a considered strategic game of chess when we build out the future of Canada versus like site by site.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like a unique opportunity. Well, now that gets to the actual question. To what degree do you see the design approach for the orbit being distinct to Innisfil versus part of a broader strategy for creating peripheral urban hubs in smaller communities? Is this an approach that can be and should be replicated elsewhere? And in line with this, to what extent do you think dramatically changing small towns should learn from one another?
It's a great question.
That's Susie composed that question, by the way. So the hydra-headed six-part question is.
I think we developed it as a prototype that was inspired by Innisfil, but intended for use elsewhere. And I think Ebenezer Howard's Garden City was also developed as a prototype, and Burning Man very, very brilliantly adopted it. What I think is possible in Canada is we're building a lot of transit, and we're going to need to expand our cities if our immigration policies are going to continue the way they are, or we're going to have to figure out a way to allow for development in a much more efficient manner, because we're not meeting the demand curve. So my mind says Orbit is a prototype that could be applied elsewhere and inspired and differentiated in other places, but really the idea of a 15-minute radial city is not new. it's just a new spin on it. But I really do think that Canada needs to start to consider prototypes for larger scale intervention to meet the population needs we have, but also in a sustainable way, centered around transit and large industry.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'm going to turn it over to Susie. I think you've got a question for both Mary and Alex.
Yeah, sure. So I guess linked to that and building off this before we get to some of the audience questions, just thinking how the pandemic has brought these kind of new trends of telecommuting and rapid real estate growth in these smaller communities. And then outside of those specific nodes like the Innisfil orbit, we see shifts in regional infrastructural needs. So the daily commuting patterns and the demands of telecommunication services aren't going to be the same as they were previously. If we think about that blurring urban, rural, periphery kind of interconnections there, they're all shifting because of the pandemic. So as a result of this, we're just wondering, are there grounds to say that the urban transformations underway in these communities are unprecedented? Does this mean we need entirely new approaches to urban design and development? Is this simply an acceleration of changes that have been underway for some time? As Alex is saying, we can take different paradigms from past urbanization shifts and try to see how they might be used in contemporary setting. So just trying to wrap our heads around, I guess, the degree to which this is distinct versus paradigmatic of some of the changes happening elsewhere.
I might just come in on the heels of what Ben and Alex were just talking about and respond to you, Susie. First of all, I think that cities are remarkably resilient and they've outlasted corporations and governments, and that will happen again. What I think is the challenge in Canada is the verticality of Canada. We don't do horizontal well. So just exactly what Alex was describing around orienting around a transit hub. CUI is doing a consultation with CMHC on the Housing Accelerator Fund, and it is a $4 billion national fund. And it's very difficult to get the mechanics together to actually have a conversation between housing, transit, economic development, mental health, land use. It's almost impossible, and it magnifies at every scale. So within the city, and that's why approvals take so long, because there are so many departments that have to be consulted, and we don't have really great collaborative infrastructure that's place-based. And then it gets even more complicated when you go up a level to the province. And then by the time you get to the national government, it's almost impossible to have a conversation that zeroes you back down into all the different factors that create a community. And so I feel that this is a really strong these are these interventions that designers like Alex can do, where they can step in and do a kind of, like Jaime Lerner said, an urban acupuncture intervention to say, we put together a table, we figured it out locally. And the other thing I would say is smaller communities are much more nimble and poised to do this. And so I really hope that the Guelphs, the Windsors, the Londons, the Cambridges, the Canadas start to do these things, because to try to do it in the larger cities across the country, a gazillion obstacles. But if you can try, and it's no surprise to me that you were in Innisfil and that Jason Raynar was in Innisfil, now he's gone to Windsor, the city manager. So he's informed by having taken a risk at a smaller scale. And I think that's where I would say we're crummy. We just don't take risks in the way that we need to. And the solutions are going to require us to do a lot more risk taking. Thank you, Alex.
Love Mary. She's the best. We're so lucky she's here. Come on.
All right. Yes. Yeah, I mean, just watching, again, the topic of this lecture is very self-interested in some ways, because we, two things need to be said. Obviously, the pandemic introduced all kinds of changes that we can speculate on, how long lasting they might be. But the other position would be that pandemic only accelerated changes which were already happening. And the population in Canada is growing older. That older population is moving out of cities. It's trading up. It's going elsewhere. Telecommuting, especially facilitated by the Zoom era, it does seem possible. things which were more questionable or more further in the future now seem actually at hand. And I really do see this opportunity. It is almost the Garden City vision where especially with the green belts in place and rail links as opposed to subway links or streetcar links, where we are looking at sort of isolated communities separated from each other in a large regional configuration, orbital configuration, if you will. It's a little like Lewis Mumford's fourth migration as well. So this is quite exciting, and I do love the idea that the small towns have the opportunity to try things out that larger cities wouldn't, and really think about where they want to go and how they want to grow. Where in Toronto, you don't have that. So these are actually excellent. Selfishly, we keep thinking Ottawa, is going to benefit in some ways because people can't afford Toronto. The next step down, for instance, in terms of population, would be Ottawa, and then further down into places like Kingston, or indeed staying within the Toronto region. But Ottawa is benefiting from all of this. The real estate market here is going crazy. I actually read some article that made reference to the average cost of a house in Missoula, Montana. It was $750,000 US, and I thought, oh my God, if Missoula, Montana is going through this, like, there's no place immune from this. This is just unbelievable. So I think we are going to think about real estate in cities and how we settle and organize ourselves across larger regions in a very different way going forward, and that we will find resonance of all kinds of thoughts about that we can see over the past 200 years. So this is a great discussion to have. Now, from the sublime to the practical, and I would argue a little bit the ridiculous, what's going on in Ottawa right now. There was a question in the chat room. Mary, you mentioned that the design of Ottawa contributed to issues with the recent protests. And what do you think those issues or what impact did design have, and how could that be changed or made to function better or to alleviate things like this in the future?
What do you think, Ben?
I don't know. I mean, Paris put up walls and had gates. I mean, I understand the problem with Ottawa was that there's just so many ways in and out of the city, and just so few people to put up barricades and stand at those gates, that the city is a really open thing. I think that the fact that the city is an open thing is a good thing, and I would not like to see it any other way. But Mary, you mentioned Toronto may be better suited to deal with those. In what way is the design of Toronto or the design of Ottawa different, and how does
I don't know how much of it is design, and it just has to do with deployment of resources, and maybe
Right.
cities learn. And Peter Slowly was on the front lines, and he did the best he could, and he's completely stuck. And whereas the chief of police in Toronto and the chief of police in Edmonton, and he had longer to think about it. They saw what happened if the trucks were let into the core. I think, I don't think we can I think that we're seeing the implications of certain things, but I don't know if that means you design a city differently. If you only had one bridge in and one bridge out, you'd be even more screwed than you are. So that's not the answer. But I do think it's more symbolic of the kind of polarization that is manifesting in Canada, and that we have, and that is rural urban, that is a knowledge worker, essential worker, that is east west. And I think that, those of us that are urbanists, I think, or who are place-based activists, believe profoundly in the benefit of shared spaces and places. And so here we have an extraordinary event happening at what could be argued as our most shared public space. So that's a lot of reflection for smart people like Alex to figure out, what is that saying about Canada's cultural identity, that's where they've chosen to congregate, and that people were so upset by some of the gestures that took place there. And what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of how we design going forward? If you think of you think of what happened in 9/11, like that's an extraordinary challenge, a tragedy compared to what we're seeing. Ours hasn't turned into a tragedy yet, to my knowledge. I don't know, maybe I haven't been on the news for 2 hours, but 9/11 was a tragedy, and it was turned into a certain kind of physical space. And will we be able to find our way? That we have a bunch of tragedies unfolding in terms of discovering Indigenous graves. And so what is the designer's response to that? And how do we stitch together some kind of a common shared narrative. I think it's a huge challenge. And that's the National Capital Commission should launch, when we get through this, should launch some extraordinary national competition to figure out how we acknowledge what we're seeing and how that could be manifested in a public art piece, design piece.
I have a comment. My business partners, my co-founder Puya, and our team, we developed a scheme for the current competition for the new capital, and we actually said that there should be a plaza across the street from the Parliament for precisely this reason. And unfortunately, Partisans was not on the short list. That's public information. What isn't public information was our scheme was to actually totally democratize and give over that space. And it was a brilliant scheme, in my humble opinion. And it would have helped, I think, the context of what you're seeing going on. But that being said, like, I think what Mary was saying before about just the difficulty of getting things done in Canada and just the fraughtness of doing anything that's not like tunnel vision, anything that involves multiple layers or multiple parties or multiple institutions. For some reason in Canada, we have a hard time executing. I'm not sure what that is, or maybe I just haven't worked on those projects outside of Canada to say whether it's difficult everywhere. My guess is still difficult everywhere, but we happen to be statistically and quantitatively the most expensive place in the world to build infrastructure. That's a problem. We have an economic crisis if our infrastructure costs twice what it does in Rome, Italy, or France. Like, that's unbelievable. We don't have an entire history of 3,000 years under Toronto in the same way that Rome does. We have indigenous cultural issues that we're working through, of course, but it's a very different archaeology in terms of what's there now and what we're working with. And I think that the indigenous policies we're working through is important, and reconciliation is important. But I don't think those things are what's slowing things down, actually. My guess is the indigenous cultures would probably get things done faster, but that's a separate issue. But I think that what's going on right now, as polarized as it is, also indicates a kind of general frustration in Canada with how we operate as a country. And that's just, I think, what's going on. I don't think it's as black and white as everybody want to make these things out to be. But Ottawa wasn't designed for the military, right? It wasn't, as far as I know, its master plan isn't designed so the military can just take over. That's what Paris was designed like. That's what Washington was designed like, even though that somehow didn't seem to work properly in recent occasions. But, you know, like, so in a way, I think it's great that Ottawa is open like that. And, you know, furthermore, people are always finding ways to protest in interesting ways. And they just happen to find the most effective way of doing it, and happen to be with vehicles. Heavy ones. Movable ones.
Movable ones. It's even the plaza across from Parliament, I'm not sure would have helped in this particular case, except for maybe another bouncy castle or a makeshift kitchen as they were setting up around the city. It's a really interesting question. Obviously what's going on in Ottawa now allows us to be a little less smug about who we are and what Canadian values are, because it seems resolutely American in a way. But it does, Alex, you're saying it's a lot more nuanced than it seems to be, but it definitely does seem to tap into this whole, rural versus urban, those who, want to look out for themselves versus those of us who want to look out for each other, which we tend to translate into rural and urban to some degree. So yeah, it raises all kinds of really interesting questions, which ultimately for this audience comes down to what impact, what does it mean for architects, and what ideas can we put out there that engage these issues, I guess. Susie, I see there's a question in the chat room that I might like to bring forward, if I may.
Sure, yeah, if there's ones that we can bring up some that jump out to you, otherwise we can synthesize across some of the different questions, whatever you think's best.
I think we'll come back to James, but I see Cameron, who's one of our students, is asking this question. This is to Alex, I guess. What do you see as the future uses of these fringe spaces between these major nodes of transportation, such as Toronto and Innisfil? Should they be designed as green belts, as explored in Howard's Garden City, or what's going to keep them from being filled in with just low density sprawl? Obviously, the provincial policies do weigh in on that, and they have growth boundaries and things like that in place. But that's a more general question. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. So his question is, what happens to the in-between spaces? Correct?
Yeah, that's right.
The problem is that we don't build with middle densities. We have a lot of hyper tall density, and then nothing. There isn't much in between. And Orbit is about creating these in-betweens that are dense but not low density and not high density. So I think what you have across Canada are incredibly diverse, incredibly large open areas. We need to encourage smarter agriculture. We need to really build that back up. We need to build up smarter manufacturing. We need to rebuild our forests, especially in locations that are, really, really accessible to highways, so that we can build mass timber factories that are actually competitive globally, which we don't have right now. We have to talk about policy at a federal level with respect to, offshoring manufacturing technologies. We have to get back to building things ourselves. The in-between across Canada is so different and varied culturally, especially for Indigenous peoples. We really need to think about how they're going to be building their future out from an infrastructure perspective as well, either on or off reserve. That's a conversation that doesn't seem to be really in, I don't know, maybe I'm ignorant to this, but I don't think that conversation is happening enough. And then, we need to think about the fact that the land is diverse and the contexts are extraordinarily unique across the country, and they need to be adapted to. And I think that's why radial cities and Orbit are good prototypes, because they really can adapt to natural features and geographies, but also cultures and economic realities. And they're more efficient. Like, people travel in diagonal lines. They don't walk in a grid. They're not transistors. They're not electrons. So I think that the in-between is very exciting in the sense that we can allow it to actually do what it's supposed to, which is be natural. And you can create more intensity in places. And I'm excited to see where Canada goes. And I really hope that we take more risk. As Mary said, this country needs to start to value the outcomes that risk gets you versus the lack of outcomes that, not taking risk gets you.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Susie, do you want to pick
yeah, sure. I was kind of mulling across a couple different questions, and I think maybe there's a way to synthesize some of this and see what some of the trends are across them. There seems to me to be an opportunity to discuss a little bit the changing nature of different stakeholders too. So we're no longer just seeing architectural firms designing a single architectural building. I think Partisans is a great example of working across these scales, from smaller scale material fabrications now to the urban scale and these larger projects. But of course, with that will come new types of collaboration with planners, urban designers, landscape architects, of course, community outreach. Thinking through the question from Mark, we have any talk about density and vertical building, city planning, embracing the consideration of the public realm. How is urban space woven into the city fabric? So we have to kind of be pulled and think about collaborations that deal more with the public realm rather than just architecture. And then some of the other comments by James and Neil talking about how we can prevent developers from taking over the agenda, especially in projects that are focused more towards kind of shopping malls and their surrounding urban sprawl and housing. So maybe both of you want to just say a few words about your collaborative process, or how you engage these different stakeholders, how you navigate their different interests, or find some unique opportunities for bringing their ideas together in the work.
Do you want to go first, Mary, or?
I want you to, Alex.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a very loaded question. Like, don't let developers drive the discussion. It's like, well, they who's going to drive the discussion? Are we going to mandate and prescribe our cities? Like, are we going to mandate everything? There's a certain amount of vision that comes from the private sector that has to be respected, even though we don't see it sometimes at its best possible outcome. I would say that we have to be careful about how well the government has done to also plan these cities so far. Like, if you look at Toronto and the tall building guidelines, it basically became a de facto prescriptive method for building out the entire city. It didn't allow for hybridization or exception. And I'm weary of ultra prescriptive approaches to city building. I like open frameworks that are suggestive, that allow people to operate in a system that has a spirit versus a letter. And I think that the problem with Toronto is you have a staff that is caught between a rock and a hard place, where developers are pushing for density and returns, but they're really trying to bring value to the city through a system that's quite rigid, and they don't have a lot of choice. And I think it becomes a situation where planners have significant professional risk, and bureaucrats have significant professional risk, because the system isn't open enough, and there's too much fear. And I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of the players in these situations on both sides. So I don't know if it's so black and white. I think we just need culturally to be bolder, to recognize that taking risk financially, culturally, architecturally, aesthetically is very important to progress. And things should feel a little uncomfortable, right? Like, I don't know, is this going to be, like, you need to feel like you're taking a bit of a risk. Does that answer that, I hope?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I guess we can also hear from Mary, but the idea also of what collaborations you thought were useful in this.
Collaborations, I forgot about that.
To work beyond just architecture and fabrication. How do you navigate that?
It's a good question. So we've been using a really cool company called Urbanize for community engagement, that actually brings statistical analysis to the engagement. It's not just, we did engagement and anecdotally this is what we heard. You can actually set up really, and no, I am not hired by them. I'm just giving them a nice friendly shout out. But it's a very interesting technology, website, and infrastructure for community engagement that will bring you quantified results, i.e. you can set up questions and you can get answers, and they can have quantifiable outcomes, and you can do statistics in terms of engagement through them, which is really important in a post-COVID context where engagement can't be necessarily recorded in person and people want their anonymity. Engagement is super difficult because people don't necessarily want their views known. They want to be able to express their views, and they want to be able to do so in the most candid way, but they feel a bit scared to say it in a forum that's open. So they want that kind of anonymity. Those kinds of digital engagement platforms are extraordinarily helpful, and they bring out some amazing results. I think that some of the engagement work our studio is doing, working with hyper local groups, very important. Getting down into the neighborhoods you work and would be working in to do, really, for lack of a better word, anthropological studies and engagement with the locals and physical spaces and places, versus just like, working in a place and seeing things contextually, really driving down into relationships and neighborhood dynamics. We've actually worked with anthropologists and storytellers such as Nicholas Spunt and others at what used to be Idea Couture. They had anthropologists on staff, and anthropology and architecture are extraordinarily important relationships in terms of just professional learnings. I've learned a lot from anthropologists, and it goes even further. Obviously, there's a huge push right now for Indigenous engagement. we're working with all sorts of interesting groups and leaders as well as architects to understand and bring positive and productive discussions to how we can engage and do that. So it's multifaceted. Again, like engagement's a big word, community is a big word, and there's all sorts of people and drivers as to how you get to the realities of any particular context and place or community.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent
Mary,
point. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ben. We're all keen to.
I was just going to say, I know Mary needs to go. I wonder if she wants to say anything to kind of wrap up, and then we'll take one more question, I think, from the list. Mary?
I just want to respond to the business about how do we make sure that developers don't run amok. I think one of the dilemmas we have, and back to my risk-taking piece, is that we're not mixed enough. We don't have as robust and heterogeneous a development sector as we need. People would be less fearful of developers if there were more small developers and more not-for-profit developers. And, I worked in the US for 15 years, and anybody on this call that's been like me in an American city knows that, over decades in the United States, there has grown up a not-for-profit, very robust community housing sector. And we need to do more to support that in Canada, so that if there was more development happening, smaller scale, missing middle, all the things we're talking about. Big developers do not have the bandwidth to do a fourplex on a back laneway here, But if we had more fourplexes and more kinds of players, and we had the money organized in such a way that they could get the capital they need, then Alex and his chums would be building all sorts of fabulous stuff, and we wouldn't have neighborhoods so fearful of it, and we would have just a much more dense weave of variety, which is what we need and what great cities have. And so I'm a bit on this, that we need to let things be smaller and let the activity start to percolate organically at a much more modest scale, and people get used to it. And then all of us, that's why I go to as of right zoning across urban environments. And it would be really interesting to see what people cooked up. And I think neighborhoods would find ways to mediate what their particular needs were. So that's part of my comment back about, oh, look out, the developers are going to swan in. We need to open these fields up, not the green fields. We need to open the field of development up and encourage more small scale, really interesting, innovative stuff.
Yeah, and I think the cities need to be much more proactive about that. I mean, cities do have lands that they could make available to not-for-profits. There are a variety of different opportunities for that too. Yeah, developers, I mean, it takes a variety of different, I'm looking at Jameson, he's got his camera off here, and I'm thinking about, one of the advantages of ULI is it actually puts developers and architects and planners and lawyers and real estate people around the table together to actually talk through these issues. There tends to be, just as we were talking earlier about the rural urban divide, this notion that the developers out there completely divorced from the community, completely profit driven. My experience with the development community is anything but that, and they're looking for much more engagement as well. So I don't think it's all that. I know there's been some comments here about the big boxes. Big boxes, I mean, depending on how you look at it, I always think they're placeholders for development in the future, and I think they're quite good in the long run. Thank goodness, large parcels of property are owned by a single owner, and then you can kind of grab them up and think about a new future when the time comes. So I'm not so against that. I do understand. I think the sentiment that in Canada, the idea of a town center is basically a smart center, shopping mall, and that, or strip shopping center, or big box center, or a power center, and that's not so good. We need to do better than that. But nonetheless, I think these entities are placeholders that have allowed us a lot more flexibility to think about what our urban future would be. Thank you, Mary. If you need to go, or if you made other arrangements, great. Please stay with us. But I just wanted to acknowledge that. We got a question here from someone called Benjamin Hayward, who I think is Ben Hayward, who is a recent grad. Maybe he's still with us. I'm not sure. He keeps going off and kayaking around the world, and we don't always see him. But Ben asks, he says, master plan cities have a mixed track record. What do you believe the correct balance of organic architectural development is within the Garden City, like the master plan that you've proposed? Would you advocate a top-down approach to how the buildings are designed within this plan? Or, I would concur with Ben. I mean, one of the things that makes a city plan different than a building plan is, a building plan gets realized in 4 or 5 years, and a city takes decades to build out. And even as it's being built out, it's being transformed, pieces are being swapped out. And flexibility is a key thing. And I think it's always hard for us as designers to come to terms with flexibility, because it seems to be, it seems to threaten our design vision in the end. So that the notion of the need for flexibility and the need for kind of control and guidance, it's a tough road to hoe. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that, you show Ebenezer Howard's diagram, but of course the garden cities that were built, Letchworth and Welwyn, don't look anything like his diagram. I mean, they got realized in a very different form than he. So anyway, I'll turn it over to you, Alex, on that question.
Yeah, I agree with Ben. I think that big ego, capital A architecture master plans, capital M, haven't worked out necessarily all that well. I think of the dozens around EUR, EUR in Rome, amongst many, many others. What is the success of them? I think depends. You could argue that New York, Manhattan was obviously a master plan. You could argue that that was a successful master plan if you like density. If you don't like density, it's not successful. So I think it's also kind of interesting to see who thinks what is successful. It's always fascinating to have that argument. I think within architecture, we have some pretty diverse expectations, but the orbit, let's just be clear, this is a master plan vision. Are they going to build it out the way it is? I hope that it's just a scaffold. I hope that the system and the frameworks are adopted, and then I hope that hundreds of architects get to build extraordinarily responsive buildings within that, and different types with different programs and different architectures. I don't see it as being a one-size-fits-all solution for the architecture in any place or space there. It's a philosophy for how Canada can expand in a pedestrian-friendly, resource-responsible way that contains sprawl. Like right now, we are basically building sprawl everywhere. It's the least sustainable way to house people. It's going to bankrupt future generations in the process. So it's really about asking ourselves, what format of the future is going to meet the demand for housing in Canada with the staggering numbers of people that want to be here? And it's just going to get stronger, in my opinion, because, this country happens to be located in a place where climate change is actually, unfortunately, this is sort of cynical, but like it gets warmer in places that are colder. A lot of our cities, even coastal cities, have significant elevation changes in them. And so they're almost, in a way, a lot of them, I wouldn't say protected, but there's some insurance policy against climate change in the Canadian geography. And so I think that there's some very smart money. You start seeing people like Ortega, who owns Zara, buying RBC Tower in Toronto as a personal asset. If that is not some kind of vote of confidence in the stability of Canada as a proposition culturally and physically moving forward for the next 50 to 100 years, I don't know what else is. And the guy's pretty intelligent from what I can tell. But to put 3% of his vast holdings into a building that's interesting. That's very fascinating. So no, I don't know if I answered that question totally obliquely, but
yeah, great. Yeah, I just just cognizant of the fact that as designers, we have a vision, and we want to make sure that everybody understands that vision, so that as this thing, it continues to exist over time, that vision can be identified and respected, and at the same time understanding that when we do something, we're basically handing it over. Exercise very little control over it.
I've learned very, very, very difficultly the realities of how much power a designer or architect has. It's nil. It's nil. We have no power. We are a consultant, unfortunately, but that's the reality. Until we are the client, until architecture as a community realizes that we need to be on the other side of the financial equation here, no, those designs and those expectations can't possibly be met.
Though we do have a role to be visionary and to inspire. I'm thinking of Burnham's quote about his master plan for Chicago. Don't dream small dreams. They have no ability to inspire. Susie, over to you. Do you want to raise one last question and then we'll sign off?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, I guess we can wrap up. There was some notes about, in addition to the challenges you were just discussing, Alex, also that anything to do with transit-oriented design has also got this extra additional synchronization of timelines for major infrastructure, which can also be a hurdle. Communities that are supposed to be built around transit get a lot of attention, and then if those links aren't there, this is part of the challenge. But I think you touched upon some of that. I guess overall, I just see this speaking to the kind of changing nature of our profession as much as the changing nature of our design strategies in these cities. It seems like there's great opportunity for it to not be about individual projects and individual approaches, but also to think about how research and different design techniques and speculations start to fold into practices that would traditionally be looking at individual projects. So there's a greater trajectory for cities to learn from one another, for small town communities to inform larger ones, the way that Mary was discussing, which is actually quite exciting. But to also think about what this might mean in terms of how we as practitioners operate and how we approach different strategies for engaging communities. So I wondered if you wanted to say a bit about that learning curve, or what you think you can take away from Innisfil that you're hoping to engage in future projects. This was your first large urban scale initiative in the office, but I'm sure there were other ways to fold in some of the previous work. So what was that learning curve like on your side?
The learning curve was steep. I would say that, like, bringing teams of experts together to help build these visions is really important. Great planners, great scientists, urban economists. Richard Florida was great to bounce ideas off of when we were developing the orbit. I just think that it takes a really strong group of highly motivated, spectacular people who help give credibility and justification for these kinds of projects. And that's been true on almost everything we're working on, bringing in engineers from around the world. I think Canada needs, again, to be more open from a expertise perspective, and more open to other generations and their thought processes. I think that the biggest learning curve for me as a kind of younger person in this milieu of architects and planners and city builders in the country is this issue that we don't know what we're doing because we're young. And we may not have built it, but I think we have some ideas of what to do better. And I think in the development community and planning community, that it's really important to recognize that, just because they built it and they're older doesn't mean it worked that well. So that was a pretty steep learning curve, because it's just simply not how people think. Again, Mary talked about risk management, and I learned very quickly that there's a lot of risk mitigation that occurs in Canada. But the key is, I think the key takeaway was just stay optimistic and believe in a better future for Canadians, and believe that we can actually meet the infrastructure and community needs. And if we work together, we can get there, and we could potentially have some pretty surprising outcomes if we're courageous about it.
Fantastic. That's a great note to leave it on. Thank you so much for all your insights and for this really captivating lecture, Alex. It's really been nice to have you here. Thank you also to all of you in the audience for attending us, joining us this evening. And I will share with you the poster that we have for our next event that's coming up. So we have our final forum lecture on Monday, March 14th, also at 6 p.m., where we'll be discussing reassembling fabrication with Michael Green Architecture and Promise Robotics. Thanks so much to Alex and Mary for a fantastic evening tonight, to Ben for the great discussion, and to all of you for joining us. I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you in absentia, Mary, and thanks to everybody. Good night.